individuals. Thank you, Reverend Katie. Enduring life-threatening economic hardships and experiencing homelessness. So at AFN this year, we are committed to continually seeking innovative solutions to these pressing issues and exploring the faith community's valuable role in mitigating these challenges. We believe this happens when we are connected to stories, policy updates, advocacy tools, and shared resources. And this is what we hope this 101 series will do. And in collaboration with our dedicated partners at WHEAT, the Arizona Food Bank, Lutheran Advocacy Ministries of Arizona, and Pinnacle Prevention, we have played a pivotal role as a co-founder of the Anti-Hunger Alliance of Arizona. Our mission for that collaboration is a community of partners using policy and advocacy to eradicate hunger across Arizona. And so this alliance and our network here with the Arizona Faith Network is dedicated to combating policies that perpetrate hunger and harm for our most vulnerable residents of Arizona. And so, beloveds, we join with you and ask you to help us advocate, march, speak truth to power, call for justice, testify, sign on letters, and show up for yourself, for your faith, for your neighbor, and for Arizona. You're invited to break barriers and build bridges with us in all of the ways that we've mentioned. And we want to thank you for being a part of this network. We hope that you consider donating $10 to $20 to keep our impactful work going. Your partnership makes Arizona communities thrive. Be sure also to sign up on our Faith Forum, where you can opt in and out of information that we share with our network, from housing updates to calls for advocacy, all of those wonderful ways to get engaged. And you can visit our website for more information. The point of this 101 series for the next several months is for us to dig deeper. We have spent a year or so now hearing the stories of people who have been impacted in the work around hunger and housing. But the 101 series is specifically designed to dig deeper, to call into our community and say, this is how you get engaged, and this is what we need you to do starting tonight or tomorrow morning. And so tonight is our first of this series. It's my pleasure to explore how and what faith communities can do to help build resilience in their houses of worship and in the geographical spaces they find themselves in. And what better people to join us than these amazing colleagues of mine here. We have Reverend Katie, who is obtaining her doctorate on resiliency work, the phenomenal Melissa Guardo from ASU, and one of my longtime comrades, Ryan Winkle. And so with that, I'm going to turn it all over to you to help us learn how to become spaces of resilience and what we can do to immediately build those bridges.
Well, good evening, everyone. I hope you've been staying cool in the slowly cooling down weather here in Arizona. I saw a funny meme the other day that said, "Don't worry, folks, Arizona is just preheating for the heat season." But it's also not funny because it's true. So I'm excited to be here with all of you and with, as Ali said, too, our amazing colleagues, Ryan and Melissa, who have been champions in the heat and resiliency space and pulled me and AFN into the heat and resiliency space to begin with. Started with a phone call from Dr. Guardaro, and hopefully you got to read Dr. Guardaro's amazing bio and the email that went out to remind you of tonight. And all I can share is she is a heat and resilience guru that I continue to learn a lot from. So our agenda sketch for this evening is Melissa's going to start with a little overview of what resiliency is, what a resilience hub looks like, and coming at that from the academic and also experience side of things and community. And then Ryan's going to hop in with like the grassroots, the lived experience with the community. And then I'm going to wrap it up with how faith is related to this and what faith communities can do in the resilience area. So bringing it a little bit back home for us on the call tonight. With all of that being said, please ask your questions as we go. Before we get started, I'd love to have you all introduce yourselves in the chat, share your name, your pronouns, your faith tradition, where you are tonight. And yeah, share if you're taking a good vacation somewhere this upcoming summer. Let us know what's a fun thing you have planned in the coming months as we are looking at a hot season. Part of why we're starting our Hunger and Housing series with resiliency is to lay the framework of how we look at all of the concerns and issues Arizona is facing today. It's really easy to get together and list off the crises that we find ourselves in, of eviction, of hunger, of housing not being built fast enough. But after we get through the list of what's wrong, we have to ask, like, how do we respond? What is the next step? And when we're looking at mountains that seem like they are so big, how, we have to ask each other, how are we going to climb these mountains together? So tonight's framework is really for us to lay the groundwork of how we can look at a lot of these systemic issues that we're facing as we move forward into the other ways to engage our issues. So good. Oh gosh, Billy, you got to get a vacation. So yes, keep sharing in the chat your name, your faith, your pronouns, where are you? And if you have a good vacation planned in the upcoming months. And again, please lift your questions in the chat as we go. I'm going to be sharing my screen. And I think I've got everything, Melissa. So I'm going to hand it over to you to introduce yourself, and let me get my screen up and sharing properly. But why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself while I get that going?
Surely. I'm Melissa Guardaro. I'm an assistant research professor in the School of Sustainability at Arizona State University. And I'm also the Associate Director for Resilience Hubs for a center at ASU called Knowledge Exchange for Resilience. I want to make sure that you have the right one. So can you go to the first slide, Katie?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I got involved in all this work around 6-7 years ago, no, more like 8 years ago. And I've seen a big shift, particularly in Arizona, in the willingness to really tackle climate change, but really extreme heat head on, and not to hide under the covers and act like, don't worry, this is the desert and this is all we can do. And I did get Reverend Katie and the AFN involved in cooling center work, and this also has evolved over time. And we did a lot of work to make sure that cooling centers were open and staffed and funded from May through September. But what if these cooling centers could be open year round? And what if, even better, we could provide services that would allow for people to not need cooling center services? So that's how the idea of getting the Faith Network involved in Resilience Hubs happened. Can we go to speaker view or presentation mode? You're muted too.
Yeah, let me try that. Give me 1 second.
I think that you might have heard of the term resilience hubs, and there's a lot of differing definitions about it. But one of the things that I want you to take away from this presentation is that resilience hubs are all about people working together. And there is a definition that has been in use for a while from the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. And this is a group of sustainability directors across the country, where Kristen Baja, who started Resilience Hubs, by the way, in a faith community in Baltimore, really was instrumental in trying to define this and have a common definition. And she said that Resilience Hubs are community serving facilities augmented to support residents, coordinate communication, distribute resources, reduce carbon pollution while enhancing quality of life. So that they really, you can go to the next slide. so that they really work at the nexus of community resilience, emergency management, climate change mitigation, and really with an eye to equity, because a lot of these issues that we're talking about being addressed within a resilience hubs are equity issues. So if you just think about a resilience hub as operating with its normal mission 99% of the time, but should there be a disruption like a wildfire, people would know to go to the resilience hub where they would be able to have electricity so that they could charge up their medical equipment or have food and water there, as well as be able to have refrigeration for medication, but really just provide those emergency services, but then also act as a place where people could gather afterwards to effectively get back on your feet. Next slide. A shorter definition is a shorter definition is a physical location within a neighborhood that's altered to serve a community around in the event of disruption and throughout recovery. So it's usually these three modes that you hear the term resilience hub referring to. Okay, next slide. But what's important is, excuse me, is that it's place-based and community-led. And it really, this idea of allowing residents to be ready for anything is the motto of Vibrant Hawaii, excuse me. And I think that it's really great that you could be ready for anything. I mean, imagine if we had all of the organizations, all of you are involved in, be ready for COVID before it happens, so that there wasn't this confusion, or be ready should there be economic downturns so that people would know exactly where to go. Okay, next slide, please. So you can ask, why do we need resilience hubs? I mean, there's so many other things that are going on. Well, I think that it's an idea that it's a community space, that it's something that people feel invested in, and it helps to really create this idea of a sense of place. And it also addresses those unequal power structures where a lot of times government holds the keys to funding streams for community. And instead of government coming in and saying, hey, I have a great idea for you during disasters, this is the community defining what you would like to see during a disaster, what kind of help you would like the government to give you. It also helps to address some historical inequities. And in a lot of the under-resourced neighborhoods, you can see that there's a sense of waiting for government handouts or government investment along the way. But just think if you could shift that paradigm and the people in their own community could get together and really take charge of that. And in that way, you would have a community space by the community for the community. And the last point is that this is a mutual aid network. And I think that all of us can point to a time in our life where without strict instruction booklets and guidance, people have gotten together and they've just bandied together to help serve one another, so that you have these mutual aid networks. And this is important because in many communities, should there be a disaster, first responders are not going to be able to give you immediate help. Next slide. So there are many different versions of what a resilience hub could be. And here on the left is an example of Mercy Corps, their idea of a resilience hub in Puerto Rico. And if you remember, Puerto Rico was slammed about 3-4 years ago with hurricanes, and then they had a power outage, and then the water didn't work, and it was just a total disaster. So their resilience hubs have communication hubs with satellite phones to be able to contact loved ones. Also having community gardens and farming resources to serve the community year-round, to have water that's potable so that should the water supply go down again, they not only have water, but then they also have off-grid solar power along the way. And the picture on my right that says, what might I find at a resilience hub? This is actually an example of what people within the city of Austin would like to see. And you can see this is a little different from some underserved neighborhoods, in that EV charging was a place that was a feature that was really requested, having green roofs, bicycle parking, solar panels. So really you can make whatever you want to see in your own resilience hub. Next slide. So a resilience hub doesn't need to be built from scratch, and in many ways, just augmenting a space that is already running is valuable because it's a space that people know and trust. It just needs to be strategically located within the neighborhoods. And the idea is also to make sure that you're allowing for that shift to carbon-free existence, and that you would have a renewable energy source, and then also a battery storage system for if the grid goes down. And there's many places that a resilience hub could be sited. It could be sited in a school. It could be sited in libraries. It could be sited in community centers. And I think the reason why we're all here is because faith centers also are an excellent location. And then the community buildings within affordable housing. Next slide, please. So the development of resilience hubs has really changed over time. And this started in Baltimore in 2014, and the next set were developed in Minneapolis. And they had funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to really try to execute this idea. Next slide, please. And the first place where this was done was in Baltimore. And you can see here that they have a network of resilience hubs, not all of them providing the same services. So some are hub sites, some are hub sites that have solar and battery storage. Some of them are actually being slated to have battery storage, but the idea is to just have some sort of neighborhood gathering space should there be an emergency. These are funded using the city of Baltimore as a conduit to these resilience hubs. Next slide. And actually, Ryan Winkle, Reverend Katie, and I visited the Baltimore Resilience Hubs at the Still Meadow Community Fellowship. And this was the next slide after that. This was an older church building that was retrofitted with solar and battery backup. It had water storage. They were in the process of building this huge community kitchen with giant refrigerators, and they wanted to have the capacity to serve the community for 5 days should the power go out. And they also, during COVID, shifted their mission. They gave vaccines, they did COVID testing, they gave out much more food than they normally would. So they were really serving their community in a time of crisis. Next slide. Another example, and slightly different, is an example in LA, the Boyle Heights Arts Conservancy. And this was an arts center, and you can think in your neighborhood that there are other arts organizations as well. So for them, their normal mission is to do job training in radio and broadcasting, and they also offer opportunities for people to MC and develop programming in both Spanish and English. And they have senior services there. They also really stress having youth programming in the arts. Next slide, please. And they operate off of these 5 foundational areas. One, that you provide programming and services. Second, that you provide some sort of communication. And this is actually a very intriguing idea, particularly in the day of cell phones, is that it's actually a radio station too, and that they could then use their radio station to inform their neighbors about an issue. And I don't know about you, but I kind of remember AM radio, maybe I'm dating myself, but AM radio was where you look to should there be some sort of disaster in your neighborhood. And then in terms of building and landscape, making sure that there's a gathering space and that you have emergency supplies to help your neighborhood, and that you have water capture and filtration system. You have power in terms of a solar array and battery backup. So you can see how you would be very self-serving. You could be a self-contained area. And for them, this was really important to have an ADA accessible building, especially since their building was very old and they needed to transform some of their areas so that they could have their less ability neighbors come in and help. Next slide, please. Another example is Austin, and they actually had plans on the books in late 2022 to convert some 6 schools into resilience hubs. And they didn't have those up and running when they had that snowmageddon with the snow, and then they lost power, and then they lost water, and then to add insult to injury, people got $10,000 bills. So had those resilience hubs been up and running then, I think that that would have alleviated a lot of pain. But coming out of that, next slide, please. Coming out of that, they kind of streamlined and rethought their process as well, that instead of waiting for the city of Austin to do an MOU with schools, perhaps there's different modes of operating these things, that you can have an agency owned and agency operated, and here think about like a city owning a community center, or you can be agency owned and community programmed, and think about having an arts organization within a city-owned building, or you can be community-owned and community-operated. And they all could work together to provide services for the area as a whole, but they would be networked together. Next slide, please. Another organization that's providing Resilience Hub assistance is CREW, and this is Communities Responding to Extreme Weather. And while their charter, if you will, says that they serve libraries, churches, schools, nonprofits, and local businesses, they are largely in local libraries, and they work through the American Library Association. Next slide, please. And you can see that they're all over. There is one in Chandler at the Sunset Library in Arizona, and a lot of them are mainly in the Northeast. It's based out of Boston, Massachusetts. Next slide, please. So they have different, excuse me, they have different levels. One is that you do a climate education event per year, and that's level 1. Another level 2 is that you have daytime support. So think about just what we're doing right now in many of the faith-based communities offering cooling center services, and that there's some sort of liaison with other local emergency managers. And the ultimate that they're striving for is to be a 24/7 overnight powered, totally equipped shelter. And this would make them part of the whole emergency management system. So that's the ultimate goal there. Next slide, please. So in Northern California, they have a slightly different network. They have a group of people who have gotten together. This is very much grassroots. And they really want to transform their neighborhoods into places where people are working together. Next slide, please. So for them, you could have resilience hubs, which is exactly what I've been talking about. But you also could have resilience spaces, and think about community gardens or some open spaces, perhaps parks. You could have resilience blocks and neighborhoods. But the idea is that you're really centered on community cohesiveness and connectivity and collaboration. Next slide. And this group even has a training program and a really great leadership program and activity guide for people. I would suggest you check it out on the web if you're interested. So next slide. So in conclusion, what is a resilience hub? And I hope that I've given you the impression that it's really people getting together to help each other, that it's a mutual aid network, that you're doing the great community work that you always are doing, but that you're really prepared should there be a disruption. Next slide. So what is the promise of resilience hubs? And I think that for me, this is super important to nurture and highlight the leadership that exists, but is really rarely seen in our local community. I think everybody knows somebody who's the air quote mayor in their community, that they know everybody, they know how to get things done. And this is an opportunity to really elevate and let this person or this group of people really run the show. Next slide. And it's also a community space by the community for the community. Ultimately, some people say that you need to have keys, the community needs to have the keys to the center, but it's just all about how the community is really driving this space. Next slide. And the mutual aid network, like I said before, next slide, to have next centralized community funding that the community controls. So it's not trickle down funding but rather you trust the people in this neighborhood to be able to manage and to distribute these funds in a way that they see fit. And lastly, next slide, most importantly too, is that first responders may not be able to get to you for a few days after a major disaster. So we want you to be really organized and understand how to help one another and to have the tools to be able to do that. Next slide. So Resilience Hub is a one-stop community hub that can help to build wealth within the community. You can have small business support. Ryan will talk about probably the Financial Opportunity Center. You can have art and placemaking, community building events, and leadership development. Next slide. Also during emergencies, it's a place where people just know to go. You don't have to wait to be told. You just say, oh, I'm going to go to the community hub because I know that I'll find other people there. I'll find food and water and electricity. And next slide. And then it's a place where you can go to coordinate recovery. So rather than having every person try to figure this out themselves, it can be a place that the community works together to figure things out. And next slide, and I think that's my last slide. Yes. So thank you very much. And I don't know if we want to have questions now or wait until the end, but that's my email address if you want to contact me.
Yeah, I'm just scanning the chat. I don't know if anybody has a burning question for Melissa right now before we kind of take it home to the community and then to the faith community. Definitely drop it in the chat. But if not, we're gonna kick it over to you, Ryan, to introduce yourself.
What's going on, everybody? Happy Wednesday evening. The weather is nice, getting warm. It's a little bit scary to me now knowing what I know about heat, that it is already hitting 100. I came into the knowledge of heat like you are, or like you did, through chance interactions of random folks that are standing up and talking about something that they just found out or know, right? What they've experimented with. And so a little bit about my background. I have been working in equitable community development and equitable economic development with neighborhoods since about 2010 when I first started at the Mesa Urban Garden. And our goal was to provide kind of a sustainable place for folks to go and learn how to farm and be resilient, right? For lack of better words, in bad times, right? Learn about sustainability and all these type of solar panels and all these things that people can think of. Through that work, I ended up becoming working with a community financial institution which did small lending options for small businesses and various neighborhoods that had projects, and that got me into the world of community development. And I'm the recent past executive director of the Rail CDC, the current director of Arizona Fair Housing Center, and the president of the AZ Asian Chamber. And the reason why I say all those things is not to like impress you and how many cool accolades and things that I do, because I think one thing about people that do things, you're the people who are doing all the things. The people who don't do things they're just going to work. But people like faith leaders, you're probably on 7 different boards, I'm pretty sure. But that being said, the importance of this type of work and the importance of the Resilience Hub and the importance of heat as kind of the catalyst of all this work is that heat is a freight train that is coming that is not going to be stopped, right? And that is having effects on the community that we have to respond to, and we are having a hard time being prepared for as a community. Melissa brought up a great point, and I saw a lot of you laughing. I think it was you, Billy. You actually had a real laugh, a laugh out loud, I think, was when she said that, the government might not get to you for 48 hours or something like that. In the COVID times and some of the things that happened around there, I think some of us experienced weeks. And as faith leaders, you had people probably coming to you looking for a shred of hope and what to do. And this is why places, churches and areas where people congregate in faith become almost a natural place for a Resilience Hub, because when someone's scared and they don't know what to do, the first thing they do is they start calling their family or anyone's around them. And they think about the school or the church. It's like you're very high in the list of immediate responses. So I think if you are setting that example from a community standpoint, that you are the person, because I think, I can't remember who said it, but it was like, if not me, then who? And if not now, then when? And you as faith leaders are that. You are not that now and that when. And where this becomes really powerful, in this mutual aid network, is the fact that you also have influence over people. So when they're coming to you looking for a shred of hope or looking for you to share some experience, you are also in the position to say, you know what? Have you ever heard of being prepared for X, Y, and Z thing? Or how did you get through pandemic stuff? Or, what are you doing when you find somebody that's passed out in the heat? What do? You have that influence. And so from a ground standpoint, from my experience, we kind of attacked this issue as what are the most immediate needs. So when we started working in 2016 with the Nature Conservancy, and that's where I met Melissa, and I got to share in all her awesome heat knowledge. We were going neighbor to neighbor, house to house, in one of the lowest income neighborhoods in Mesa, and just asking, hey, so what happens to you when you feel heat, or do you feel any effects? And they're like, oh yeah, it's Arizona, and so it's always like that. And you know what, man, like I got to pay my rent and my kids got to get somewhere. So whatever you're telling me, like, let me know, like right now what has to happen, because I don't got a lot of time, And so the idea of getting past that conversation to a point where they're thinking, oh yeah, I was feeling ill the other day with a headache when I was outside, or I was walking to the bus stop the other day with my kid and they were getting a very red face. That's an outcome of heat on a person's body, right? And they weren't thinking about that. They just thought, man, this is how it is for me, and this is how it is for me in my life, because they didn't have somebody like you telling them, or me telling them, that this is what happens to them, when this can strike on you. And if that did happen and they got into a bad space, how many of those folks, especially some of the elderly folks, would just sit in their house and be hopeless until it was time to call the ambulance, And why wouldn't they reach out to a faith center or a library or somebody to go get that immediate help? And then when that immediate help need was over, there should be somebody there to say, you know what? This is always here, and we're not here only for emergencies. We're also here doing financial education. So if you're having issues and you really always wanted to buy a house, and your mom's also involved in this, and your daughter, why don't you come in and we can help you with credit work or credit repair, things like this, right? So in my experience also, we started a financial opportunity center, paired that with small business technical assistance, and all of that was kicked off through ARC interactions in neighborhoods. And so when you talk about resilience, it's not that resilience is not a fun thing or uncool. It's just that you have to think about how fast somebody's going to trust you to talking about what their needs are. So I think was it you, Melissa, that brought up the speed of trust? Someone brought up the speed of trust, and it was like, how fast is someone going to trust you to trust what you're saying? And I think as faith leaders, that's very important in your line of work, is that speed of that trust, right? And so part of this work is finding out how fast you can reach somebody, how fast you can relate to somebody, and what is the mechanism that makes them want to interact with you, and start divulging information of what their most immediate need is, to then be cradled or handled, or however you want to call it in the people terms, of brought to a better level. Because I think it's been pretty much our mantra, is that the folks in the neighborhoods don't only have the right to control their future, but they also have the responsibility of controlling their future. And back to that point of the government not getting to you fast enough, if you build something that's resilient. You don't need the government to get you fast enough. I mean, there's some things that you'll always need help for, but that network of I always can't ever think of this word, but it's that care, that community care word. What did you say it was, Melissa?
Mutual aid.
Mutual aid networks. Yeah, when you have that, that's the first step, right? So yeah, that's what I have for you for right now, and hopefully maybe it inspired you to think about who amongst your congregations could help you with this, because you can't do it alone. Nobody can do anything alone. You need a lot of people to help you with this work.
Thanks, Ryan. Again, just if everyone wants to drop any questions they have in the chat, and then I'm going to dive into the faith piece of this, and then we're going to open up for discussion and Q&A. So, all right, let's get going. So first I have to preface this. I want to see your guys' faces. So let me get this adjusted real quick. I always feel so alone when I can't see you when I'm presenting. Okay. So first and foremost, I am doing my doctorate of ministry project on faith communities and resiliency. So I give great thanks to Ellie for making me present, because it made me actually work on my doctorate project that I'm severely behind on. But I really do think that there is a connection, as we'll dive in this presentation, between community resiliency and the role of congregations, specifically about how do we think about outreach and mission. So as we move through this, I just want us to think like, are the activities that our community is doing for outreach and mission the activities that we should be doing for our neighbors and our neighborhood? Are we meeting folks where their needs truly are? Or are we doing mission and outreach to make ourselves feel good so that we feel like we did something? And is it really for our egos? So we're going to dive into that in just a minute. But just echoing a few things that Melissa said, that, community resiliency is both the disasters, like responding to the disasters, the ability to recover, but also the challenges and crises that arise from disasters that we see in climate, but also things like the pandemic. We're still seeing our neighborhoods hurting. February was the highest eviction rate ever in the history of Arizona. This is still fallout from the pandemic, you all, along with a lot of other issues. And so we really do need community resilience work, and we need it now to be able for our communities to begin building up characteristics that allow them to withstand and recover from these adversities and injustices a little bit more effectively. From my perspective in the work that I'm doing around community resilience, I'm looking at it through a heat lens, but also the broader lens of what is the climate crisis going to bring with it? What are we going to be facing in the coming years? And we know that climate, I call it a climate crisis because I don't think it's changed. It's changing, but it's changing at crisis level right now. And that's just the reality of where we're living. We see this with the extreme weather events, more frequent and severe weather events, such as hurricanes, tornadoes that we're seeing all over the place right now. Heat waves here in Arizona, which is a whole other presentation we have. We see it with floods like in San Diego. Our own Vasus area got flooded. My sister right outside LA got flooded every day when rain just wouldn't stop. We're seeing a ton of infrastructure issues. We're seeing a lot of issues around this extreme weather. And so these patterns are adjusting, and they're going to continue to adjust. We hear from our climate scientists until we're able to stop warming our planet, which unfortunately for us in Arizona, and again, this is a whole other conversation we'll do in this series, means it's going to get hot, and hotter. And we're going to have to learn to adapt to that. But it also, the climate crisis is also creating resource scarcity. We know that here in Arizona about water. We know it with soil erosion. We know that destructions of homes in places, especially like we saw in Maui, where it was already having issues with affordable housing and rebuilding. We know with floods. And we know the climate crisis particularly strikes vulnerable communities, communities that have already been historically disenfranchised. Here in Arizona, we can take the heat map and overlay it over the redlining map. And it is the communities that are the hottest that were historically redlined. And so it's not necessarily the communities that do have the largest amount of capacity to bounce back from a disaster that comes with the climate crisis that are getting hit. It's communities that have very limited resources because they have been hit over and over again with economic crisis, with a weather crisis, with a family crisis. And it gets really hard to bounce back from that. Just touching a little bit that so much of the pandemic brought a lot of this to light. We hear over and over again that the pandemic shined a microscope, that it shined a flashlight onto the issues that our most disenfranchised communities are facing, and that includes health. We're seeing folks die from heat here over and over again. We're seeing folks get sick and stay sick here as well. And we're also seeing people who were already struggling to continue to struggle to be with social and economic vulnerability. So that's what Ryan was talking a little bit about, is that part of our resiliency has to be, how do we get folks back economically on their feet? How do we create webs of relationships that allow folks to have layers of connections and layers of resources so that when something does happen, they have the ability to bounce back from that? And that's the point of a resilience hub, is creating a multifunctional platform for emergency response, community engagement, capacity building, investing in and strengthening relationships and those multi-layer approaches. You know, that when something hits, it's going to bounce back, is how we think of resiliency a little bit. But what does this have to do with faith communities? So I believe that faith communities, and Melissa might argue with me on this, but I think we are probably the best positioned and most powerful communities to be able to approach all of these resilient issues by creating community resilience centers. We are uniquely positioned to serve as community resilience hubs. We are agents of change. We have shown this throughout history, that we leverage both our moral and scriptural guidance, our social networks, our resources, our communities, to building a more sustainable and just world for current and future generations. It's what faith communities do. But not only that, we're also located, this is why Melissa called me to begin with, we're in every neighborhood. So when you're thinking of how do we create a heat respite center or a cooling center in every neighborhood during heat emergencies, or how do we respond when there's a flood in Flagstaff in every neighborhood, some of the only buildings that are in every neighborhood are faith communities. And usually our communities are not only there, but we've been there for a while. So we've been invested in those neighborhoods as well. We know our neighbors and we know our neighborhood. We know the stories, we know the people, we know the businesses around there, and we know how the activity flows. On top of that, faith leaders, and I recognize this is not always, okay, and it's not every faith leader, but generally, faith leaders have trust and credibility. Faith leaders and institutions hold spaces in their communities where folks believe they can trust and relate to them. This trust, as Ryan was talking about, that speed of trust, that is faster with localized faith leaders, specifically within faith leaders that are in a particular neighborhood. It is likely as long as that faith community has a safe and reputable reputation in that neighborhood, that the neighbors are going to trust that pastor or that church leader faster because they know, hey, you know, you hand out lunches every day at noon. When I was hungry, I went there and got a lunch. You know, the communities that are doing good work, there's already that speed of trust there. And faith communities are motley crews, I like to say. They are wonky places. I mean, think about, where else does a teacher, a politician, a construction worker, a preacher, a college student, a community organizer hang out every week? When you're going into your space of worship and prayer, you're going into a space with a diverse group of people that have diverse roles throughout the community, that have a web of networks that you're really not going to find a whole lot of other places. These social networks and connections within their neighborhoods and beyond can be leveraged to be able to disseminate information, mobilize resources in a crisis, coordinate response efforts, and really they will know within the faith community, hey, I know where folks hang out that are going to need help if there's some emergency coming. We know our neighbors, we know our neighborhood, and we are very diverse in the resources we can connect. And frankly, we have the space. You know, we have facilities, we have resources, we have physical infrastructures and churches and mosques and temples and synagogues that can serve, as we've seen. You know, when a asylum seeker crisis happened, where did folks end up? They slept in our fellowship halls, they slept in our sanctuaries, they slept in our prayer rooms. When there is a flood, this just happened in Flagstaff, was it 2 years ago? When there was a flood and FEMA needed to come in and do distribution centers, it was at a church. I think it was the Episcopal Church up there. They become distribution centers, they become shelters, they have the infrastructure to both respond in an emergency, but also use that space to better build up the community. So community resilience hubs are talking not just when there's an emergency, but how do we use this to make sure that we're building resilience all year long? We have the moral and scriptural and spiritual obligation. In short, we have to care about this stuff. Like, we should care about this stuff. We're told we are supposed to care about this stuff. And our scriptures say, command us to care about this stuff across all traditions, right? We are supposed to show up in the crisis. We are supposed to help our neighbor when they need help. We are supposed to work for justice and equality and equity. This is not just oh, it'd be nice if we did this thing. This is a commandment in our traditions for us to do this. And through that, we also have value-based action for change, meaning we are guided by our core values of every community, of justice, of stewardship, of caring about our neighbor, and not just that they're not dying on the street, but caring truly about the wholeness of their lives and how they are functioning in their community. And the reality is, you know, as we're working to make a positive impact on our communities, we don't just leave it there. I talk about this a lot in the heat work. You know, Melissa and I have this conversation a lot. It's not just about the Band-Aids, right? We need Band-Aids, and meaning Band-Aids like our cooling centers, they're really important, but they are a Band-Aid on the problem that we are facing. They are a charity space where there is an emergency and we are responding and we are letting folks come in, but they are there because they are wounded. So they're a Band-Aid to stop the blood from flowing in that emergency moment. The reality is there's a much deeper wound. And so I'm gonna make you guys read a little bit of scripture with me tonight. So like as pastors do, I'm gonna frame this a little bit theologically and with scripture. So my favorite scripture is the story of the hemorrhaging woman. I love the scripture. If you're gonna ask me to preach, I'm gonna preach on the scripture and we're gonna talk about it. And so let's see here. I'm gonna call on a couple folks to read this slide. It's a very short scripture, and again, I'm speaking from my tradition as a Christian, but I think it's a story that will flow across all traditions. So, Madam President, Board President, will you read this first slide for us?
Now there was a woman who had been suffering from a flow of blood for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his cloak, I will be made well." Immediately, oh, sorry.
I was going to call on someone else for the next slide. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Secretary, Board Secretary Garrett, will you read this?
Immediately, her flow of blood stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my cloak?"
Marilyn, our board member for UCC, will you read this?
Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my cloak?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you? How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it.
Thank you, Marilyn. Deborah, will you read this last slide?
But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease."
Thank you. Thank you all. So there's a lot in the story, but the thrust of it is there is a liberating power in naming. So when we're talking about resilience, we're not just talking about the emergency. We're talking about like how the healing stories, like we hear with the hemorrhaging woman, renames, reclaims, and repositions people in a place where they can stand on their own feet and live their lives in a healthy, whole way. So in the story, you know, the thrust is when Jesus looks at her and he calls her daughter. Society called her unclean, unwell, unworthy. And yet she had the audacity to believe that she deserved healing and wellness and wholeness. And despite all of her fears, she went and reached out for Jesus. She knew what needed to be done to be healed. She knew what she needed to do to get to the next phase of her life, as our neighbors do too. Most people know what they need, but they don't have the opportunity to get to that place. And so she went and she reached out and she was radical and she claimed her own healing, and Jesus renamed her and repositioned her in the community and with acceptance. So the social aspects of how folks are, we know the labels that we put on people: poor, homeless, sick, dirty. There are so many issues that play between where people are and where they need to be to quote unquote pull themselves up by their bootstraps, which you can't actually do. Someone please try. If you can actually pull yourself up by the bootstraps, please someone tell me how, because I think there's gravity involved in that. But what we hear about when we're talking theologically and the Jesus stories of healing is it's not just a matter of band-aiding the wound. It's a matter of naming, repositioning, and doing justice. So it's more about charity versus justice that we talk about in faith communities a lot. There's an emergency response versus systemic change. And while we need to feed the hungry and while we need to clothe the naked, we are also called to flip the tables. We are also called to change the systems so that when we're putting the Band-Aid on our neighbor because they are bleeding, we're not just changing that Band-Aid out every day. We're asking, how did you get hurt in the first place? What is causing this wound? Why are you hungry? Like, we are so grateful and honored to feed you, but like, why is it that everyone in this neighborhood is hungry all the time? And so how do we fix it so that our communities, while we create these resilience hubs and look at it through that lens, don't have to be resilient all the time? We hear that a lot from talking to people. I am tired of being told I need to be resilient because these folks are hurting. Our communities are hurting. And so part of our role in this is making it so that folks can have dignity, can live their lives like almost every single person I've ever talked to wants to, on their own, while like also figuring out where we need to flip those tables and where we need to hand out the food boxes in the in-between time. So how it's hard. It's not an easy answer. It's going to be contextual. Every faith community, every neighborhood, as Ryan has said, is different. Every block is different. So how we do our mission and outreach matters. How we spend our resources as congregations, how we use our space matters. If we're selling our church, who we sell our church to matters, because it's going to shape that community in the future. We have to start with asking ourselves within what we're doing now, is this actually helping our neighbor? Does it heal our neighbor? Does it heal our neighborhood? Are we using our resources to actually heal and build up the neighborhood? Are we flipping the tables that need to be flipped? Are we fixing the systems that need to be fixed? Or are we using our resources to serve our neighbors so that we feel better about ourselves? And that's a hard question to ask. I've been in those places where I've had to ask with decisions I've made as pastor, why are we actually doing this? And the reality was, it was because it made us feel good. And that's not the right answer for where we are called in our faith traditions to be. Do we know what our neighbors need? Do we know what our neighborhoods need? That's a place to start. Do we know where the pain points are? Do we know the greatest thing our neighbors and our congregations struggle with? It's a process, right? This is part of the work I'm doing in my doctorate, is developing the manual and curriculum to help congregations get to that place of answering those questions. Now, again, I don't want to make it sound like I'm shaming the Band-Aids and charity work, because we need them. We have to have something that stops the bleeding in the moment of. But we also have to be asking why that happened in the first place. And so we have to change the face of our outreach as people of faith. We have to be looking at mission and outreach through a community resilience lens. We have to be asking about our resources, and we have to be making sure we're serving our neighbors in the best way that we can. And a place to just start, it sounds really simple, but talk to your neighbors. Feed folks, have community dinners, bring people to a table and ask them what's going on. What needs to be fixed? What needs to be addressed? How can this faith community on this corner be the best neighbor and partner that we can be? And with that, I'm going to stop sharing because I think I'm over time.
You're never over time, Reverend Katie. Never, never, never. Garrett asked a wonderful question. Before I get to that, I just want to say, wow, y'all, what a way to open up this 101 series, to dig deeper, to learn about the different ways that we can become engaged right now. And that's the point of this, right? So much of what we have done at AFN is served as a bridge to these educational resources and connected us to community groups, to public, private, university partnerships, all of that amazing stuff. And it's great to get that information, but now it's time to act. There is no better time to become engaged other than now. And I think all of our presenters tonight demonstrated how that's possible. And so I want to thank you all for your time. And Garrett says, are there communities in our metro area where we think we could roll out a neighborhood focused program and led by the local faith community that would be a success, a role model? And if so, where? I'll turn that over to you three. I'm going to pin you back up.
Yeah, we are actually wow, I can talk. I think I'm done for the night. We are actually piloting a community resilience hub at Wesley United Methodist Church. I think it would be great to bring Pastor back in to speak on that. It's in South Phoenix, and Ryan and Melissa have many plans for this location too. Do you guys want to hop in?
First thing that I would say is that I am a firm believer in a place-based approach, meaning that you pick a small area and you focus all your resources on that one place. Because when you spread them too far and too wide, you have a much lesser effect. So to your point, I think really any place is a good place, right? That you choose and that you have space. As far as the South Phoenix location, that is a space that we've chosen through, I guess, being invited, and we having open talk where people said, yes, I'm interested in this. Because the important piece is, and this is kind of like, I'll give you a story of a community mural. People are always like, hey, we want to do a community mural in this neighborhood. And a lot of times we have to ask, cool, like who's doing it and who wanted it? Because sometimes people want to go do a mural to a community instead of having a community participate in the mural they want, right? So that's kind of the point I'm trying to make there.
Yeah, and with the, go ahead, Melissa, I'll jump in after you.
And I think that there are many places where there's great programs that are going on, and with a little bit more money and a few more volunteers and some funding to really pay people to get positions, it could just be amplified, not only in that space, but also in other spaces too. So I think that if you're looking for communities where this can happen, look where there's already action in communities.
Yeah, and along with that point, is we were running a heat relief center there, and how the Resilience Hub came to be was that at the end of closing down one season a couple years ago, the community came up and said, hey, where are we going to get food after this? And we didn't realize they were coming in and eating the Nutri-Grain bars and the fruit and getting water there because they had no access to nutritional food. So since then, AFN worked with the pastors at Wesley to make it a St. Mary's food box distribution site. And we had to fight to get that done because we were told there were already too many distribution sites in South Phoenix. So we did have to pull on, and that is where an AFN type organization is helpful to be the bridge and to pull on our kind of political weight that we have in those spaces to make it happen. But that's one step, right? So food boxes are still kind of in that charity mindset. Like we're wanting to, with partnering with Melissa with ASU and with Ryan, take that to the next step. Like how do we expand it beyond that?
Yes, I love that. I hear that Wesley is a great place to start. And Barisha, I hope I pronounced your name okay. I am a community hub director at Pilgrim Rest. Yep, and would love to connect in this work. So yes, I see that Reverend Katie just talked about how Pilgrim Rest does really, really good work. Before we turn it over to our farewell, are there any last comments or questions from the collective? Go ahead, Billy.
Thank you, Allie. This is wonderful, as always, with you guys. I always love hearing Melissa speak, as well as you, Ryan. As far as Wesley goes, as one of my churches, we have a great leader there this time. And, we have a really excellent pastor, as we did Sylvia as well, but Tawanda is something else. And the thing that I love about the work that we're all doing with Wesley, as someone who is her coach as well as oversight, is that it inspires her to greatness as well. It's very much a quid pro quo. And, so I think, as always, funding is, it's always going to be a piece. But I know, at least from my position, I would do everything I could. We just got her a small grant. We've got her, I'm in line for a possibly much bigger one. And we'll just see where it goes. But Wesley is a wonderful place to start. And I'm just so grateful that we have focused on that church for a variety of reasons.
Yes, Garrett, go ahead. Thank you, Billy.
It occurs to me as we talk tonight that the sad thing we've omitted is the connectivity among all of our neighborhood churches. We've allowed faith to become something that divides us into congregations that meet on Sunday and have activities on Wednesday or Friday or whatever, instead of communities that really know each other. We can't keep going that way. And we have to find a bridge, and AFN is uniquely positioned to be that bridge. Wesley Church is, Wesley United Methodist Church is right across the street from the Crozier Center. We have a Latter-day Saint Stake Center located less than a mile away, as I recall. The stake president at that stake center is very involved in his community, knows it really well, and is trying to do things for other churches. But somehow we've got to get outside of our own boxes, as has been said before. I'm preaching to the choir, and go and visit with each other and figure out what we can do to help. Our church has been involved in, quote, emergency preparedness for as long as I can remember. I still have buckets of hard wheat and beans and other kinds of things in my garage waiting for the day when I don't have enough to eat. And that was great for a time. It gave me a sense of comfort when I was raising my family. But we're at a different place now with heat. And in particular, we're at a different place now with lack of community and connectivity. And I would love to see us accelerate our efforts as Arizona Faith Network to bring some of these neighborhood churches together, to convene them. I know Bishop Dolan of the Catholic Church would be supportive of these kinds of efforts. Certainly we would be supportive, and I'm sure others would as well, if we can simply love each other and be willing to serve each other without any other thought. And on behalf of our church, I can't make commitments, but I can make a personal pledge that I will do my best to try to make this kind of thing more of a priority for us. You would be interested to know that our church has rolled out in the last year and a half a program in Utah called My Hometown. You can Google it and probably find out something about it, but it started in some of the West Side communities in Utah. It is community organized. It is faith leader led. People are called from various churches to work together on a community council to establish a community resource center. And so I know the model exists in various places. I'm delighted to learn about the one we've been introduced to tonight. And they're the best. I operate from the position that the best ideas haven't been thought of yet, and what we need in Phoenix is the best idea for us. And I would love to be part of that process.
Garrett, I just want to walk around. I wonder if you carry a briefcase or a backpack, or you have a rolling thing. I just want to be with you all the time and just really just get engaged in the work and seep some of your passion. I think that is the work that you do and the leadership that you have in the community and with your different congregations is to be modeled by all of us. And I think you ask really important questions. What is it that we can do And that's why we have a whole little theological dialogue section, not little, it's a big theological dialogue section of Arizona Faith Network, is for us to find ways in which we can continue to build and support each other's efforts, as opposed to finding ways to separate and to focus on our differences in a harmful way, right? And so I'm grateful for that. We have one more question. Barb is in Benson, and she said she would love some thoughts about rural settings. We're a population of about 1,000 with a membership of about 100. And Cedric, yes, this will be available in a follow-up email later.
I would think, and Melissa and Ryan jump in on this too, I think faith communities are more important in rural settings, actually, because there's less buildings and less places that folks particularly gather. And so even more, you're going to be more uniquely positioned within that space to run a model. And then, of course, again, and also, I think you probably know your neighbors a lot better than most urban settings. I almost like, now I want to go run a community resilience center in a rural setting. Let's go to Benson, because I think that there's something just natural that comes with smaller communities that where the faith particular role will work really, really well.
I think one of the things that we find in a small community is that we can be much more experimental. We can go out and try something and fail quick and get up and do something else. And also we're, how can I say this? Our community is generally very much more conservative than our denomination. And, but we also find within a small community that there's still the sense of community bonding, and you know, people as individuals will step up where other denominations won't open the door to collaboration. So, you know, we're getting it done, but it's nice to have a different you know, point of view. We're not as hot as Phoenix, so y'all can come out and relax with us.
Our response to that real quick is, and Garrett, I want to just pay you some wages really quick. I was born in Bountiful, Utah, and I moved to Mesa later in life. We were a Catholic family there, Catholic family in Mesa. And so my experience alongside of the LDS community has always been kind of close. Supposedly, I'm a descendant of Joseph Smith somewhere. I mean, not Joseph Smith, I'm sorry, Brigham Young, somewhere in that lineage on the Mormon side of my family. I don't know totally. But I think that one of the things that we've modeled on is the ward system and the effectiveness of that branch out of how you communicate. I think it's very powerful. And Barbara, we just got a place in Pine, and we've started spending a lot of the holidays there. And we've noticed that the biggest focus and where people gather are the churches and the faith communities. And people in smaller areas also happen to just be more resilient kind of in general, because when it snows up in Pine, you're on your own, you know. So you're kind of on your own there. So you have to know your neighbor, and you have to be able to be prepared a little bit. So I think your challenges are a little different, but the person to person relation is not.
Right.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. I think that there might be a distance between where all of you live, but certainly not in your connectivity. And in that way, a lot of this work that we're trying to do in urban environments is trying to smash people together to get them to work together. Whereas I think that in rural areas, you're just much more resourceful. So I think that you would be the perfect place for a resilience hub, but a resilience hub done your way with something that would amplify the work that you're already doing.
Especially if you have a project like, if you had like a Lego build day of how the downtown should be or something, like do something really original and fun that puts people together. And you'll be surprised how many adults bring out that childlike, you know, effort to do something.
Yeah. And the only thing I would add to you, Barbara, is when you're talking about like systemic issues, at least at the state level, that's something we hear all the time. is that like rural communities are ignored, right? Like, and so that's where you need like an AFN or a stronger bridge to be alongside your priorities for your community. And so, but I really do, I love the concept of like learning how rural communities do things, because I think you're right. Most of we're trying to like make people care about each other in urban settings, which rural folks kind of do generally easily.
Y'all, this has been amazing. I am just so incredibly grateful for each of you for being present. So to Melissa and Ryan and Katie, thank you for your very thoughtful, hard work. It is not just brain labor, it is emotional labor. It is embodied labor. And I want to just extend my gratitude to each of you for the work that you do. It is an honor and a blessing to be in this realm with you. And Billy and Barb and Jean, Angel, Deborah, Barisha, Maureen, Joyce, Bo, Terry, Vasu, our Christian Church Arizona conference, whoever's on that end, Garrett, Angie, and Cedric. Thank each of you for being a part of this network, for believing in the work that we do, for wanting to be a part of a movement to bring the different various expressions of faith together to do the work that is needed in the world. It is hard and it is good, and we are grateful for each of you. So thank you for joining us. Our next program is next Wednesday. It is with Matt Gross with Bread for the World, who is going to give us an update with Bread for the World, or the update on the Farm Bill. And and I want you to come with crafts, because we're going to be doing a card creating, letter writing campaign during that time. We're all going to sit together. I'm going to have some fun games for us to be playing virtually online while we create these cards and letters to write for Bread for the World, and then invite your faith communities in the next week or so post that program to also write letters as well. So please, once we get all of that confirmation from Bread for the World, that'll happen tomorrow. Keep an eye out on our newsletter, and then a special email will go out to you to invite your congregations or your houses of worship to participate in next Wednesday's event. Because the Farm Bill, although it's a federal bill, impacts us all in very unique ways, and in particular here in Arizona. And I would love for our Southwest Arizona voices to be heard at the federal level, and that happens with these letters, and come to learn all about it. But thank you, thank you, thank you. Blessings to you. Be well. Remember to look in the mirror at yourself tonight and say, I love you, and that you deserve all of the goodness in the world. Amen. Blessings to everybody.
Thank you.